I just found out my dad has another family he abandoned 20 years ago. The truth about who he really is has destroyed everything I thought I knew about our family. It started with a simple notification, a Facebook friend request from someone I didn't recognize. His name was Evan Walker, and his profile picture showed a man in his mid-30s with dark hair, hazel eyes, and a friendly smile. Normally, I ignore random requests, but this time, curiosity got the better of me. I clicked on his profile and saw something that made my stomach twist. He shared my last name. A message came through almost immediately. It read, "Hi, I know this might be strange, but I believe we're related. I'm your half-brother. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my mind racing. This had to be some kind of scam, right? I wasn't an only child, but I knew my family tree, 2 siblings, all accounted for. My dad, a church-going family man, was always upfront about his life. There was no way this stranger could be telling the truth. Still, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. When I showed my mom, her face scrunched with confusion. She scanned the message before blurting, "This is ridiculous. Your father would have told us if something like this were true." I wasn't so sure. Something about her reaction seemed too dismissive. When I finally confronted Dad that evening, his reaction was the real shock. His face turned a shade I'd never seen before, like all the blood drained out at once. He sputtered, stammering, and then did something completely out of character. He yelled, "This is nonsense! Some random guy wants attention, and you're buying it? Just delete the message!" His tone was sharp, almost panicked. Mom looked between us, her expression shifting from confusion to growing unease. "Tom, why are you so upset? If it's nothing, why not just laugh it off?" Dad didn't respond. Instead, he stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. For the first time, I felt the quiet unraveling of the trust one had in him. If you had asked me a month ago, I would have told you my family was normal. Boring even. My dad, Tom, is 58. A hard-working contractor, always the guy with the solution for everything. You know, the fix-it-yourself type who spends weekends tinkering in the garage and thinks duct tape is a miracle invention. Then there's my mom, Linda. She's 56, a kindergarten teacher who everyone loves because she's that kind of mom, sweet, empathetic, always baking casseroles for church events. Growing up, our family wasn't rich, but we were solid. My parents were a team. Or so I thought. I have a younger brother, Dylan, who's 22, and I'm 28. We were raised on Dad's corny jokes, little league games, and long family road trips. I'd never once questioned who my dad was or what he was hiding. Dad always seemed like the kind of guy who had his life together. He's not warm exactly. He's more the gruff but dependable type. He taught me how to change a tire, yelled when I stayed out too late, and always hugged me on my birthday, even though he wasn't really a hug person. Then Evan's message came, and everything changed. At first, the house felt tense in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. Dad was always busy. He started spending hours in his workshop or leaving the house for errands that no one asked about. Mom kept putting on this forced cheerfulness that fooled Dylan but not me. Looking back, it was like watching a glass of water wobble on the edge of a table. You know it's going to fall, but you can't do anything except wait for the inevitable crash. I couldn't stop thinking about Evan's message. The idea that some random guy on Facebook was claiming to be my brother was absurd, but the way he'd written to me stuck in my head. It wasn't some crazy scammer energy or vague clickbait. It was specific, direct, and unsettling. Against my better judgment, I messaged him back that same night. "Hi, I'm not sure what you mean by us being related. Can you explain?" His response came within minutes. "I didn't want to just drop this on you, but I've been looking for your dad for years. He was married to my mom before he left us when I was 12. I'm pretty sure he's your dad too. Can we talk?" And then came the photo. It was old and slightly warped, like it had been stuck in a drawer for years. But even with the faded colors, I could see it clearly. A younger version of my dad, maybe in his late 30s, standing in a park with a boy, Evan. He had that same damn smile, the one he wore in every Christmas card photo. The boy was grinning too, but all I could focus on was my dad. I stared at the picture, my stomach churning. I replied, "This doesn't make any sense. My dad's been with my mom for almost 30 years. Are you sure you have the right person?" Evan responded with a long message. I know this sounds crazy, but I've been piecing things together for years. My mom and your dad got married in 1984 in Indiana. They had me, but things got bad when I was a kid. He started drinking, and there was a lot of fighting. By the time I was 12, he left. Just vanished. We never heard from him again. My mom said he might have started over somewhere new, but I had no idea where until I found your family photos on Facebook. I felt my hand shake as I typed back. What are you talking about? My dad doesn't even drink. That's when Evan started sending proof. First came their marriage certificate, Thomas Walker and Sarah Jones, dated 1984. Then came old family photos, Evan as a baby, as a toddler, at Christmas, with the same man I called Dad, in every photo. And finally, court documents. A restraining order from 1997. A divorce finalized in 1998. The name on every document was identical to my dad's, Thomas Henry Walker. I tried to poke holes in his story. Maybe it was a mistake, someone with the same name? But then Evan told me things I couldn't ignore. My dad's birthday. The name of my grandmother. Even the scar on his left hand, which he got from an accident as a teenager. It's him. Evan wrote. There's no doubt. The more I read, the sicker I felt. Evan described a life I couldn't recognize. According to him, their family had been in constant chaos. He said his mom had worked 3 jobs to make ends meet, while Dad spiraled into alcoholism. There were nights Evan hid in his room with a pillow over his ears to block out the screaming. He remembered watching his mom pack up broken glass after another fight, and then, one night, his dad walked out and never came back. I kept hoping he'd call. Evan wrote. For years, I thought maybe he'd regret it and come home. But then he didn't. He just started a new family instead. The words hit me like a freight train. I spent the rest of the night staring at the evidence, my head spinning. How could this be the same man? My dad was strict but never violent. He never even drank a beer at family barbecues. The idea that he had this whole other life, a violent one, was incomprehensible, but the proof was there. It was undeniable. The dad Evan described and the dad I knew might as well have been 2 different people. The man I grew up with wasn't perfect, but he was reliable. He wasn't the warmest guy, more of a fix the problem, not the feelings type, but he showed up. Every soccer game, every busted bike tire, every late-night school project that needed power tools, he was there. So how could this same man, the guy who made pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse for me when I was a kid, have a past that sounded like it came from a Lifetime movie? I started paying closer attention to him, trying to reconcile the man in Evan's stories with the one who raised me. And honestly, it was like seeing my dad in a new light, one that cast shadows I'd never noticed before. There was his temper, for starters. Growing up, he never hit us or anything, but when he was angry, you felt it. He'd slam doors, raise his voice, and make the whole house feel smaller just by being in it. Back then, I thought it was normal, just dad stuff. But now I couldn't help but wonder if those flashes of anger were glimpses of the man Evan had described. And then there were the little things I'd never questioned before. Like how Dad rarely talked about his past. He had a story or 2 about growing up, but he never mentioned old friends or life before my mom. Even when we asked, he'd brush it off with vague answers, as if it didn't matter. But it mattered now. After Evan's messages, the tension in our house was impossible to ignore. Dad started avoiding me, leaving the room whenever I came in. He stopped helping my younger brother with his car project and spent most of his time locked in his workshop or disappearing on errands. That stretched for hours. Meanwhile, my mom. God, I don't even know how to describe her. She was in denial, I think, but not in a way that felt dishonest. It was like she was desperately holding on to the version of my dad she thought she knew, trying to convince herself this was all some big misunderstanding. I couldn't bring myself to tell her everything Evan had said. I wanted to, but the words wouldn't come out. How do you tell your mom that the man she's been married to for 30 years might not be who she thinks he is? I started doing my own digging, piecing together the timeline of my dad's life before us. The details were hazy, but everything Evan told me checked out. He'd grown up in Indiana, and Dad had moved to our state around the same time Evan's dad disappeared. The dates lined up. The court documents Evan sent were real. There was no doubt anymore. This was the same man. One night, I tried to confront Dad again. I wanted answers, something to make sense of it all. But the second I brought up Evan's name, he exploded. I'd never seen him so angry. He was yelling, red-faced, practically shaking. It scared me. He never outright denied it. Instead, he kept repeating that it didn't matter, that it had nothing to do with our family now. As if abandoning a child and beating a wife were things you could just move on from. Watching him, I realized something. My dad wasn't the man I thought he was, but he wasn't the man Evan described anymore either. He was something in between, a man who had buried his past so deep that he couldn't face it, even when it came knocking on his door. That night, after Dad stormed off, my mom sat at the kitchen table in stunned silence. She didn't say a word, but I could see it in her face, the doubt, the heartbreak, the betrayal. For the first time in my life, I saw my mom look genuinely lost. After that night, our house turned into a Cold War zone. Dad didn't try to explain himself, didn't apologize, didn't do anything. Instead, he just disappeared into himself. He left for work earlier than usual, came home late, and hid in his workshop like it was some kind of bunker. If I walked past him, he'd barely look at me. Mom, on the other hand, was falling apart. She wouldn't admit it outright, but you could see it in the way she moved, like she was carrying something too heavy for her to bear. She kept trying to talk herself out of it, saying things like, "Your dad's been a good man for years," or, "This doesn't sound like him." But I knew. She knew. She was just afraid to say it out loud. Then Evan sent me another message. This time, it wasn't just photos or stories. It was a police report. Dated 1997, filed by his mom. Domestic violence. My dad's name was right there in bold letters as the suspect. Seeing that report, I can't even describe it. It wasn't just anger or shock. It was like my stomach had been ripped out. This wasn't a story from someone else anymore. It was real, documented, undeniable. My dad had done this. I couldn't keep it to myself. That night, while Dad was out, I showed Mom everything, the photo, the court records, the police report. Watching her face as she read through it all was one of the hardest things I've ever done. She didn't cry right away. She just stared at the papers in silence, her hands trembling. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't know who I married," she said. The next night, it all exploded. Dad came home, and for the first time, Mom didn't tiptoe around him. She laid it all out, everything Evan had told me, the evidence, the lies. I wasn't in the room for most of it, but I could hear them from upstairs. She was yelling. He was yelling. Then there was this crash, like someone had knocked over a chair. I froze, thinking it was about to get worse, but then everything went quiet. The next morning, Mom told me she'd asked him to leave. "He needs to figure himself out," she said, her voice shaking. "And I need to figure out what I'm going to do." Dad left that afternoon. He didn't say much, just packed a bag and walked out. No apologies. No explanations. Just gone. I wanted to feel something. Anger, relief, anything. But all I felt was this emptiness. Like the life I thought I had wasn't just shattered, it was gone entirely. After Dad left, the house felt hollow. Like it wasn't really ours anymore, just a shell of what it used to be. Mom tried to keep things normal for Dylan, but she wasn't fooling anyone. You could see it in her eyes, she was barely holding it together. I kept in touch with Evan. At first, it was just about getting more answers, trying to make sense of everything. But over time, our conversations became different. Less about Dad and more about us. About how weird it felt to suddenly have a sibling you didn't grow up with. Evan told me more about his life, about how his mom had to work herself to the bone to keep a roof over their heads after Dad left. He told me about the times he'd lie awake at night, wondering if his dad ever thought about him. Hearing him talk like that broke something in me. I realized I wasn't just angry at Dad for what he'd done to us. I was angry for what he'd done to Evan, to Sarah, to an entire life he'd walked away from without a second thought. Mom eventually opened up, too, but it took time. She admitted that she noticed things over the years, little inconsistencies in his stories, times when he'd get defensive for no reason. She chalked it up to stress or bad memories. But now she couldn't stop replaying it all in her head, questioning every moment of their marriage. As for Dylan, he took it hard. He's always been close to Dad, Way closer than I ever was, and I could see how much it hurt him to lose that image of the guy he thought was a hero. He didn't talk about it much, but one day I caught him in the garage, staring at the half-finished car they'd been working on together. He didn't say a word, just picked up a wrench and got back to work. Dad, meanwhile, didn't exactly try to mend things. He called once, about a week after he left, but it wasn't an apology. It was more like damage control, a way to justify himself. It was a different time, he said. I was a different person back then. But how do you explain away abandoning a family? Hitting your wife? Starting over like none of it ever happened? You don't. Mom didn't let him off the hook either. She told him she needed space, time to think. For the first time in their marriage, she put herself first. I didn't answer when he called me. I couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. The weeks after Dad left were a whirlwind of emotions I didn't know how to process. Anger, sadness, guilt, it all blended into this weird numbness that hung over everything. I couldn't stop replaying the moments in my life where things suddenly didn't add up. I remembered how Dad would sometimes zone out during family events, like he wasn't really there. Or how he'd avoid certain questions about his past, brushing them off with vague answers. Even little things, like how he'd always insist on driving on road trips, probably because he didn't want us wandering into a town where someone might recognize him. Evan and I talked more than ever during that time. He told me about his mom, Sarah, and what their life was like after Dad left. She sounded incredible, honestly, a woman who'd been through hell and still managed to keep it together for her son. Evan said she never badmouthed Dad, but she didn't sugarcoat the truth either. She told me once that some people are just born runners, Evan said in one of our chats. They'll never face their mistakes, they just move on to the next thing, hoping it'll fix them. Hearing that hit me hard. I couldn't help but wonder if that's all my dad had been doing his whole life, running. Running from the mess he'd made with Evan and Sarah, running from himself, and eventually running from us when it all caught up to him. Mom started seeing a therapist, which was honestly a huge step for her. She even encouraged Dylan and me to go, though I wasn't ready at first. She told me one day, "Your dad's mistakes don't define us, but we can't pretend they didn't happen either." I couldn't argue with that. Eventually, Evan and I decided to meet in person. I was nervous as hell, but I felt like I owed it to him, and to myself. We met at this little diner halfway between where he lives and my town. Seeing him in person was surreal. He looked so much like Dad that it caught me off guard. Same hazel eyes, same crooked half-smile. But his demeanor was completely different, calm, steady, nothing like the gruff, stoic energy Dad always gave off. We talked for hours, swapping stories about our lives. It was weird how many parallels there were. Evan grew up watching his mom struggle to keep things together. I grew up with a dad who acted like the weight of the world was on his shoulders, even though he had a family that adored him. By the end of the night, it felt less like I was talking to a stranger and more like I was reconnecting with someone I should have known all along. Meeting Evan was like opening a door I didn't even realize had been locked. For the first time since all this started, I felt like I could breathe again. There was still so much about my dad's past that I didn't understand, but connecting with Evan made it easier to carry the weight of it all. He told me he wasn't looking for closure anymore. He'd given up on that years ago. What he wanted now was to build something new, and that stuck with me. I realized I'd been so focused on trying to make sense of Dad's mistakes that I'd forgotten about the rest of my life. Mom was doing the same thing. Therapy helped her more than I expected. She told me she decided to stay in the house, at least for now. "I built this home," she said one night over tea. "Just because he left doesn't mean I have to." Dylan finished the car he and Dad had been working on. He didn't say much about it, but I noticed he started driving it more often, almost like it was his way of making peace with the whole situation. As for Dad, he tried reaching out again, sending me a long email about how he regretted his past but didn't know how to fix it. He claimed he was trying to be better, but it felt hollow, like he wasn't really ready to face the damage he'd done. I didn't respond. Maybe I will someday, but not yet. Instead, I've been focusing on building something with Evan. We've met up a few more times since that first diner visit. Each time, it feels less like I'm meeting a stranger and more like I'm catching up with family. He even came over for dinner last week and met Mom and Dylan. It was awkward, but also kind of nice, like we were all figuring out how to move forward together. This whole thing has been one of the hardest experiences of my life. It's shattered the way I see my dad, my family, even myself. But it's also shown me how resilient we are. My dad's lies don't define us. They never did. I'm still angry, and I'm still hurt, but I'm also hopeful. For the first time in a long time, it feels like there's a path forward. And for now, that's enough.